The cake sat in the middle of the conference table, lit with so many candles it looked more like a bonfire than a dessert. Through the flames, I read the message in bright blue icing. Bye bye, burden, to Phoebe. Finally getting shipped off where she can't drag us down anymore. Laughter rattled off the walls as my coworkers toasted with cheap champagne, spilling it on the table while mocking me with glee. Someone had even taped anchor symbols to my chair. Get it, Drew shouted, pointing. Because she's been sinking us since day one. They roared again. The cruelty in full display. Petra, my supervisor, climbed on a chair and raised her plastic flute. A toast. To whatever poor souls have to deal with Phoebe next, may they have patience and very low expectations. I stood in the doorway, clutching a cardboard box with my desk plants and sweater, feeling my knuckles ache from the grip. I'd known they disliked me, but seeing their unfiltered disdain stung differently. When Petra spotted me, she smirked. Oh, come on, Phoebe, it's just office humor. Can't you take a joke? This is exactly why you never fit in here. Drew thrust a slice of cake toward me. At least eat some before you disappear forever. We spent almost $30 on it. I took the plate, scanning the faces that had stolen my ideas, spoken over me, dismissed me, and now openly celebrated my so-called demotion. Thanks for the send-off, I said quietly, placing the untouched cake back on the table. Petra tilted her head. Any parting words of wisdom before you go? I smiled faintly. Just one thing. I'll see you all on Monday. Confusion rippled through the room as I walked out. They thought I was being banished to Rochester. None of them knew that on Monday morning. I would step into my new office at headquarters as Vice President of Marketing Operations, directly overseeing their division. 3 years earlier, I'd joined Westridge with a strong reputation for reviving struggling departments. My previous company credited me with doubling their conversion rates in less than 2 years. I arrived ready to analyze, optimize, and transform. But Westridge wasn't built on results. It was built on politics. From the first day, I was an outsider. Meetings were won by the loudest voices, not the best strategies. Credit was claimed by whoever had the right lunch companion. I tried to adapt, speaking up more, suggesting processes, creating systems, but Petra and her clique silenced me at every turn. If my ideas were good, they dismissed them publicly, then quietly adopted them later as their own. If projects failed, blame landed squarely on me. The Middletown campaign was my breaking point. I had written a detailed report warning against the exact approach they insisted on. When it predictably failed, Petra announced to the division head that my insufficient research was at fault. My colleagues snickered while I was written off as dead weight. It wasn't an accident, it was calculated. Lunch invites skipped me. Celebrations happened without me. Reviews ended with the same patronizing phrase. You're just not a culture fit. I almost resigned dozens of times, sitting in my car rehearsing speeches before work. But something in me refused to let them win. Instead, I documented everything. I tracked campaign outcomes, mapped client risks, built shadow systems, and kept meticulous notes of every stolen idea and false accusation. 6 months ago, everything changed in a 40-second elevator ride. The CEO, EMTT Kurile, stepped in just after Drew had spilled coffee down my sleeve. Rough morning, he asked kindly. My instinct told me I had one shot. Actually, rough 3 years. I answered. In the short ride, I outlined 3 major flaws in our marketing approach and suggested concrete solutions. EMTT listened, nodded once, and said, interesting. 2 weeks later, I was summoned to headquarters. My excuse to my team was a dentist appointment. Instead, I presented executives with my full analysis and a vision for restructuring. No complaints about mistreatment. No office politics, just data and solutions. They offered me the vice president role on the spot. I had only one request to let my transfer be announced as a move to the failing Rochester office. I wanted them to believe I was gone, stripped of influence, before they discovered the truth. And so they threw me a goodbye party, mocking me with cake and anchors, never suspecting what was really coming. Driving home afterward, I felt no anger, just clarity. For 3 years, they had shown me exactly who they were when they thought I didn't matter. On Monday, they would learn just how much I had been paying attention. The weekend was spent in careful preparation. I reviewed personnel files, drew up a 90-day restructuring plan, and chose a charcoal gray suit that I'd never worn at the office before. On Sunday night, I slept soundly for the first time in years. Monday morning at 7:30 a.m., I walked into my new office, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and my name already on the door. At 9:00 a.m., I started a video call with my former team. Their faces appeared on screen, still in the same conference room where they'd celebrated my exile. The lone anchor decoration swung behind Petra's head. "Good morning, everyone." I began evenly. They froze, eyes wide, jaws slack. Phoebe Petra stammered. "Aren't you supposed to be in Rochester? This call is for our new VP." I smiled faintly. "That's correct. And this call is with your new VP. Me." Silence swallowed the room. Drew blurted, "This is a joke." "No joke," I replied. "As of this morning, I oversee all regional marketing teams, including yours." Their shock was almost audible. Petra sputtered about transfers and miscommunication, but I cut her off. "You were told what you expected to hear. None of you bothered to verify it. That lack of diligence is just one of many issues we'll be addressing." Then I shared my screen. The organizational chart showed a dramatic reshuffling. Petra was stripped of leadership. Tate and Nina were reassigned. Drew was placed under a new supervisor. Their faces fell as I explained each change. "These adjustments were approved at the highest level," I said calmly. "No one is being fired, though some of you might wish otherwise when the audits are finished." I ended with one final note: I'd be visiting in person on Wednesday. "Be ready to present your contributions with specific examples." Their silence was heavy, their faces pale. I ended the call, leaned back, and allowed myself a single deep breath. Phase 1 was complete. They knew who I was now. They just didn't yet know what I had planned next. Wednesday arrived like a storm front. I drove to the office deliberately early, pulling into the parking lot before even the janitorial staff had finished their rounds. The building looked the same as always, gray glass reflecting a gray sky, but stepping inside felt different now. I wasn't dragging my feet toward another day of belittlement. I was walking into my territory. I paused at the door of my old department, listening. Their voices were hushed, frantic, like students cramming before an exam. Petra barked orders, trying to reassert control. "We'll show her we don't need micromanaging. Stick to the talking points. No one admits fault." The irony almost made me laugh. For years, they had reveled in my supposed incompetence. Now they were terrified of having to prove their own competence. When I entered, every conversation stopped. Petra attempted a smile, but her knuckles whitened around the file she clutched. "Vice President, welcome back," she said stiffly. "We're ready to present." I sat at the head of the table, the very spot Petra had once told me I'd never belong in. "Then let's begin," I said evenly. One by one, they tried to spin straw into gold. Drew exaggerated numbers, but I had the real data on hand. Nina claimed credit for a client recovery plan that was word for word mine from 18 months earlier. Tate stuttered through a jargon-filled presentation that collapsed when I asked a single follow-up question. Each time, I let the silence hang, forcing them to feel the weight of their own empty contributions. Finally, it was Petra's turn. She launched into a glossy slideshow filled with vague promises and buzzwords, ending with, "Under my leadership, this department has consistently driven innovation." She looked at me like she was daring me to contradict her. I didn't contradict her. I opened the folder I'd been carrying. "This," I said, sliding copies across the table, "is a record of the last 3 years. Campaign projections versus outcomes. Documented adoption of proposals. Patterns of accountability and blame." Their eyes scanned the pages, faces draining of color. I leaned forward. "Notice anything?" Petra's voice wavered. This is cherry-picked." "No," I said, calm but firm. "This is audited fact." "I know, because I built the system that tracked it all. Quietly, patiently, while you told me I wasn't a fit for the culture." The room was silent except for the soft whir of the projector fan. Then I spoke the words I'd rehearsed for months. "This is no longer your culture. It's mine." Petra sputtered, searching for footing. "You can't." I cut her off with a raised hand. "Effective immediately. You are relieved of departmental leadership. You'll be reassigned to compliance, reporting directly to me." Her mouth opened, then closed again like a fish on a hook. As for the others, I outlined clear expectations, documented deliverables, transparent workflows, zero tolerance for idea theft. If you can rise to that, there's a place for you here. If not, I let the pause speak louder than any threat. When the meeting ended, no one spoke. I gathered my folder and walked out, the sound of my heels echoing against the tile. For the first time, I felt the air in that office shift, not thick with derision, but charged with the knowledge that things had changed forever. And yet, I wasn't done. Because regaining power wasn't just about setting things right inside the office. It was about revealing the rot that had been spreading for years, infecting not just my team, but the company itself. Headquarters had asked me to clean house. I intended to do exactly that, starting with the person who had shielded Petra's behavior from above. The shield behind Petra had always been invisible but unmistakable. Harold Merton, regional director. He was the kind of leader who thrived on appearances, a smooth talker with a golf membership and a Rolodex of contacts. Harold didn't care about outcomes, only optics. Petra had been his protégée, her arrogance emboldened by his protection. Any complaint against her mysteriously vanished. Any failure was excused as a learning opportunity. He had made her untouchable. Until now. After my department visit, I drove straight to Harold's corner office. His assistant tried to intercept me, saying he was in a meeting. I smiled politely and walked right past her. Harold looked up from his desk, visibly irritated. "Phoebe, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be settling in at headquarters?" I shut the door behind me. "I am. And part of my role involves evaluating regional leadership." His laugh was forced. "Evaluating? Come on. That's just semantics. You've always been diligent, but you don't understand the politics of running a division." "On the contrary," I said, laying a thick binder on his desk. "I understand them perfectly. This is 3 years of suppressed reports, buried complaints, and altered outcomes, all traced back to decisions you signed off on or conveniently ignored." His face reddened. "That's confidential." "Not anymore. The board has already seen a summary. They asked me to verify the details in person." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You made a career out of protecting mediocrity and punishing anyone who threatened it. That ends today. For the first time." Harold's confidence cracked. He tried to bluster about his years of service, his relationships with the higher-ups, his indispensability. But I'd already seen the board minutes they were looking for reasons to move him aside. I had just handed them enough ammunition to make the decision swift and clean. Consider this a courtesy, I told him quietly. You can resign with a narrative of early retirement, or you can stay and face a formal audit. Either way, your influence here is over. He stared at me for a long moment, then at the binder, then back at me. His jaw clenched. You think you've won, don't you? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. When I walked out of his office, his assistant was standing nervously by her desk. He's not to be disturbed for the rest of the day, I told her calmly. She nodded, eyes wide, already sensing the shift in power. By evening, word had spread Harold had decided to retire effective immediately. The same people who had once snickered behind my back were now whispering a different tune. The anchors taped to my chair were gone, replaced by nervous greetings and stiff politeness. But I wasn't after their respect. I was after something bigger. Because the truth was, the rot hadn't started with Petra or even Harold. It had started higher, and the next person on my list wasn't going to go quietly. Her name was Victoria Greaves, Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy, a woman known for her icy composure and razor-sharp instincts. To outsiders, she was untouchable, the architect behind Westridge's glossy public image, the one credited with steering the company through turbulent markets. But behind the polished reputation, she was the reason people like Harold and Petra thrived. Victoria didn't get her hands dirty. She didn't need to. She orchestrated power plays like a chess master, moving pawns like Petra to protect her position, sacrificing employees she deemed expendable in order to make herself look indispensable. 3 years ago, she tagged me as expendable. I discovered the proof while combing through archived internal memos, buried in a chain of emails. I found her signature. Phoebe lacks the temperament for leadership. Recommend assigning her to Middletown as a stress test. If she fails, she can be quietly transitioned out. Petra had parroted those exact words in my review. It wasn't Petra's invention. It was Victoria's directive. So while Harold was the shield, Victoria was the hand holding the sword, and I had no intention of letting her keep it. The first step was subtle. At headquarters, I began seeding conversations with executives, framing questions like, why does regional leadership consistently reward underperforming managers? Have you noticed how often strategic failures get reframed as successes? Do you think our data on campaign ROI reflects reality or narrative control? Executives hate the word narrative control. It makes them think of manipulation, of hidden agendas. Soon enough, whispers began circling back to me, doubts about Victoria's methods, questions about her selective metrics. The second step was bold. I compiled a dossier, not unlike the one I'd dropped on Harold's desk. This time, it was thicker, laced with side-by-side comparisons, projected outcomes versus actual outcomes, all signed off by Victoria. Failures hidden under inflated numbers, losses disguised as market repositioning, and every time, someone else was blamed while her record remained spotless. The third step was the most dangerous. I requested a private meeting with the CEO, EMTT Karil, the man who had first listened to me in that elevator. When I placed the dossier on his desk, he flipped through it slowly, his expression unreadable. Finally, he closed it. Do you know what you're doing? Phoebe. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm showing you why this company's culture has been rotting from the top down, and why the person you trust most is the one poisoning it. He studied me for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, He smiled faintly. Most people bring me problems. You bring me solutions. What do you suggest? That was the moment I realized he already knew. He'd suspected Victoria, maybe even watched her maneuver for years. He just needed someone brave enough or reckless enough to put it into evidence. I suggest a restructuring of corporate strategy, I said evenly, and I suggest I lead it. Carolee leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. If I give you this rope, Phoebe, you'd better not hang yourself with it. I met his gaze without flinching. The only one who should be worried about hanging is Victoria Greaves. Victoria didn't summon me right away. That wasn't her style. She waited 3 days, to be exact, long enough for the whispers to reach her, long enough for her allies to feed her pieces of information, long enough for me to know that when her assistant called and said, "Ms. Greaves would like to see you in her office now," it wasn't an invitation, it was a summons to a battlefield. Her office sat on the top floor, all glass walls and skyline views, like a throne room designed to remind visitors who held power. When I entered, she didn't stand. She didn't smile. She simply gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "Phoebe," she said smoothly, voice like silk over steel. "You've been busy." I sat without breaking eye contact, just doing my job. "Your job," she repeated, almost amused. "Interesting, because it looks more like you've been undermining mine, stirring doubts, planting seeds, handing around little binders full of half-truths." "Not half-truths," I said evenly. "Data, facts, outcomes you signed your name to." Her lips curved into a cold smile. "Outcomes I delivered. Phoebe, do you think the board cares about the fine print? They care about results. And I gave them results. Meanwhile, you," she leaned forward slightly, "you were sent to Middletown and nearly drowned. That's the only data point that matters." There it was, the dismissal, the reduction of my entire career to one engineered failure. I let the silence hang just long enough before sliding a slim folder across her desk. "Funny you mention Middletown, because this is the full paper trail: emails, timestamps, directive notes. Every piece showing it wasn't my failure. It was yours. And Petra's. You set me up to fail. But instead of failing, I kept receipts." For the first time, her composure faltered. Just slightly. A flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "You think you're clever," she said softly. "But you're not the first ambitious climber I've dealt with. People like you burn fast and bright, and then you disappear." I leaned forward. "The difference is I'm not playing your game anymore. I've already changed the rules." Her jaw tightened. "Do you know what happens to people who come after me, Phoebe?" "Yes," I said, standing slowly. "They either vanish quietly, or they take your chair." The silence that followed was electric. I turned toward the door, but before leaving, I looked back at her one last time. "I'm not here to survive you, Victoria. I'm here to replace you. The board knows it. Carolee knows it. And soon enough you'll know it too." Her smile returned then, sharper than glass. "We'll see." Walking out of that office, I felt the shift in the air. It was no longer a battle of survival. It was a war of succession. And I had just declared it. Victoria fought like a queen under siege, quietly at first, then with open ferocity. Within a week, I noticed subtle shifts. A budget request I'd submitted vanished accidentally from the system. A client presentation I'd scheduled was reassigned without explanation. A rumor circulated that my promotion had been a diversity hire experiment. All classic Victoria tactics: sabotage, misdirection, discrediting through whispers. But unlike Petra or Harold, she underestimated me. She thought I'd fight back defensively, scrambling to prove myself. Instead, I built my offensive. Step 1: Data exposure. I met directly with the analytics team, the ones who had always been instructed to massage the numbers for Strategy's quarterly reports. They'd been under Victoria's thumb for years, afraid to contradict her. But when I showed them my documentation, when I proved I already knew how she manipulated outcomes, they started talking. Within 2 weeks, I had raw datasets that painted a very different picture of Westridge's performance-inflated growth, hidden losses, clients retained at twice the real cost, numbers Victoria had built her empire on. Step 2: Allies. Instead of hoarding the information, I began selectively sharing it with executives who had grown tired of her control. The COO, for instance, had long suspected Victoria of siphoning resources to protect her pet projects. When I showed him the proof, his response was immediate. "Whatever you need, Phoebe. You've got it." Piece by piece, I dismantled her support system, converting her allies into mine. Step 3: Public stage. The quarterly strategy summit loomed, a high-stakes meeting where Victoria typically dazzled the board with polished slides and lofty visions. This time, I arranged to present directly after her. She didn't object, perhaps believing she could crush me with comparison. The day of the summit, she was flawless. Crisp suit, commanding tone, sweeping projections about market capture and brand dominance. The board nodded along, accustomed to her theater. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium with nothing but a single binder and a quiet confidence. "Victoria has shown you what we hope to achieve," I began. "I'd like to show you what we've actually achieved." Slide after slide, I laid out the raw numbers: campaign ROI, retention rates, operational costs. No spin, no gloss, just facts. Then I overlaid her projections against the truth. The discrepancies were staggering. The room grew still, the air tightening as the board realized how deep the deception ran. Finally, I closed the binder. This isn't about blame. It's about integrity. Our company can't afford strategy built on illusions. We need strategy built on results. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Karile, seated at the head of the table, spoke. "Thank you, Phoebe." When I sat down, Victoria's face was perfectly composed, but her knuckles were white around her pen. She knew what had just happened for the first time. She'd lost control of the narrative. The board adjourned with promises of further review. But in the hall afterward, I caught the COO's glance, the CFO's nod. Momentum was shifting. Victoria had cracks in her armor, and I had every intention of driving a wedge straight through them. Victoria didn't retreat. She doubled down. Within days of the summit, her fingerprints were everywhere. A surprise performance review landed in my inbox, full of vague accusations of insubordination and unprofessional ambition. An anonymous email circulated, claiming I had falsified my data to secure promotion. 2 of my newly won allies suddenly grew cold, clearly pressured, reminded of what Victoria could do to careers. She was wounded, but she wasn't finished. This was her counterattack. But I hadn't come this far just to play defense. The final move began with exposure. Through the analytics team, I discovered something bigger than projection inflation. Victoria hadn't just twisted numbers, she had quietly funneled budget from lower departments into her pet projects, masking the deficits by forcing cost reductions elsewhere. Entire teams had been downsized to cover her empire building. People had lost jobs, not because of performance, but because Victoria needed to keep her own records spotless. I compiled everything: financial records, approval chains, testimonies from managers who had been coerced. It wasn't just manipulation, it was misappropriation. The timing was perfect. The annual board ethics review was scheduled 2 weeks later, a meeting where, ironically, Victoria often positioned herself as the guardian of corporate values. That morning, she took the floor as always, calm, polished, speaking about transparency initiatives. The board members listened politely. She was halfway through a slide about the trust in leadership when I stood. "Forgive me for interrupting," I said, holding a slim leather folder. "But since this review is about ethics, I believe the board deserves to see the full picture." I distributed copies. Inside the audit trail of her budget diversions, the downsizing orders, the manipulated reports, black and white, incontrovertible. The reaction was immediate. The CFO flipped through pages with a frown deepening by the second. The head of HR muttered something sharp under her breath. Karile didn't speak. He just leaned back, watching Victoria with the same detached interest a lion might show a wounded gazelle. Victoria tried to respond. "These are distortions taken out of context." But the COO cut her off. "The context is, people lost their jobs so you could protect your image. That's not strategy. That's fraud." The room buzzed. Questions flew. Demands for explanation. Victoria, for the first time in her career, had no script. By the end of the session, the board had voted to place her on administrative leave pending investigation. But everyone in that room knew what it really meant. Her reign was finished. As we filed out, she caught my arm. Her grip was tight, desperate. "You think you've won," she hissed. "But power is never permanent. Remember that." I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "You're right. Power isn't permanent. But integrity lasts longer than deception." Her hand slipped away. The next morning, the internal memo went out. "Victoria Greaves has resigned from her position, effective immediately." And that same afternoon, Karile called me into his office. "The board wants you to assume interim leadership of corporate strategy," he said. "Consider it a trial run." "Trial run?" I smiled, already knowing it was more than that. For 3 years, they called me a burden. They taped anchors to my chair. They celebrated my supposed downfall with cake. Now, I wasn't just their boss. I was the woman who had toppled a queen. And this was only the beginning.